So the UK, the US and Australia have unveiled plans to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines to combat China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region, all part of the AUKUS Pact, a defence partnership between the three nations. Here's President Biden speaking alongside Rishi Sunak and the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
The United States can ask for no better partners in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of our shared future will be written. Forging this new partnership, we're showing again how democracies can deliver our own security and prosperity, and not just for us, but for the entire world.
Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, the destabilizing behavior of Iran and North Korea all threaten to create a world defined by danger, disorder, and division. Faced with this new reality, it is more important than ever that we strengthen the resilience of our own countries.
The AUKUS agreement we confirm here in San Diego represents the biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history, strengthening Australia's national security and stability in our region, and delivering a superior defence capability into the future.
In an interview with the BBC's Chris Mason, Rishi Sunak says China represents a challenge to the world order.
Prime Minister, is China dangerous?
You know, China is a country with fundamentally different values to ours, and it represents a challenge to the world order. And that's why it's right that we are alert to that and take steps to protect ourselves, protect both our values, stand up for our values and protect our interests. And that's what our new integrated review does, makes that crystal clear. And I think the actions of the government over the past few months under my leadership demonstrate that we do take that challenge seriously. We've blocked investment in sensitive sectors like semiconductors, for example, and it's important that we keep the country safe, and that's what we'll continue to do.
We can speak to the defence editor at The Economist, Shashank Joshi. Thanks very much for coming on. What problem, what weakness is this setting out to resolve, geopolitically, if you like?
Well, fundamentally, it is addressing the absolutely phenomenal growth in Chinese military capabilities over the last 10 years. If you want me to give you a sense of that, consider the fact that the Chinese defense budget now exceeds those of Australia, India, and Japan combined. Between 2014 and 2018, just that 4-year period alone, the Chinese Navy launched more tonnage than the navies of France, Germany, or India. I could give you an endless list of statistics like that. The scale of China's defense buildup is pretty much unprecedented in peacetime, other than perhaps Imperial Germany. And that is changing the geography of the Pacific. It's making all of these countries, not just Australia, but also Japan, India, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, worried about a possible invasion of Taiwan, a possible act of Chinese aggression elsewhere. And so what this is doing is saying, a country like Australia is saying we're not just going to be hemmed in our little corner of the Southern Pacific. We're going to play a role in making sure that if China does decide to do something silly, we have the capability to bring some serious firepower to the table and not just cower in the corner and, for thousands of miles to the south. So this is an effort to deter China and close that enormous gap that has been opening up for year after year and year.
So specifically, where is Taiwan in all this, apart from sort of obviously vulnerable?
Well, if you think about the range of scenarios that the Americans and Australians and others are worried about, there's a whole list of them. You could point to the East China Sea, where China has a dispute with Japan. You could point to the South China Sea, where it has disputes with a number of regional countries. You could point to things like, security pacts it's attempted to sign with the Solomon Islands. You could easily imagine China intervening in a South Pacific island country to defend its interests in the way that America has intervened in the Caribbean, say. But above all, Taiwan is at the very top of that list because that is ultimately considered to be an existential problem for the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping views this as something he has to do for his legacy, to reunify the Chinese mainland with the island of Taiwan, which is, of course, effectively an autonomous country in all but name. And that would be the biggest conflict we would see anywhere in the world if China were to invade it. And it's undoubtedly true. Western officials, in the US and Europe and in Asia, are getting more concerned that this could be something that could happen sooner rather than later. Certainly they know that Xi Jinping has told his military, the People's Liberation Army, to be in a position of being able to invade Taiwan by 2027. Doesn't mean he will, but to be able to do so. And so this arrangement is partly about trying to deter something as destabilizing as that.
So what is this money buying in terms of sort of hardware? Okay, one submarine's the same as the next as far as I'm concerned, but I mean, you can tell us different.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, one submarine is very different to another. And to give you an example of that, if you were on one of the diesel-electric boats that Australia has right now, you would not be able to sail all the way up to the South China Sea without having to surface to charge your batteries and to snorkel. They don't have the endurance for that. And once you surfaced, you could be spotted, you would lose your stealthiness. You might be attacked by the Chinese Navy in a conflict. Whereas a nuclear submarine, you are effectively constrained only by the amount of, the survivability of your crew. If you have enough food, if you have enough food and supplies, you can stay underwater for as long as the sailors can bear it. And that means they are much, much stealthier boats that can travel much further away for longer periods. And ultimately, that means Australia can use these in much more flexible ways. So what it is buying is at least 8, possibly more, nuclear-powered submarines. These are only submarines that only 6 or 7 countries in the world have at the moment. No one has ever sold a nuclear submarine to another country. And they will be able to bring, for example, missile strikes against a Chinese invasion force in Taiwan that a diesel-electric boat would not be able to do in the same way. It just wouldn't. So you're buying a significantly more sophisticated capability that is much more stealthy, much more survivable. And on top of that, it can also do some interesting things like collect intelligence, deploy special forces ashore that diesel-electric boats may not be as capable of doing.
And where are the jobs in all this? And one would hope it's not happening to create work for defence companies and create jobs, important though that is. But I suppose it is a happy byproduct of some British firms, some British jobs.
This is game changing for Barrow up in northwest England, and of course Britain's building submarines anyway. This isn't changing that. But what this means is it will be building many more submarines. It will be supplying nuclear reactors to Australia, not just to the UK. It will be working alongside the US much more closely than it otherwise would have done. And if you look at the numbers involved, we're talking completely extraordinary numbers. The Australians, over the next 32 years or so, might be spending around $250 billion. That's extraordinary. For the Australians, I think they're looking at several thousand jobs in Adelaide, in southern Australia, where they plan to build the SSN AUKUS submarines for themselves. We'll build the first ones. They'll see how they go. There'll be prototypes, and then the Australians will build their own ones in Adelaide. But it'll be a joint effort, and there's going to be thousands and thousands of jobs over here. Of course, as you say, that isn't the main purpose, but I think the defence industrial implications are going to be really dramatic.
I mean, and briefly, is this politics proof? I mean, because inconveniently for some, that politicians change. You might have different ideas. The most obvious problem if Biden isn't the next president again, perhaps Trump gets in again. What happens? What does that change?
I think that is a big worry. Right now the deal has bipartisan support. The Labour Party here supports it. It was initially initiated by Australia's right-wing party. It's been taken up now by its left-wing party in government. And in America, both Republicans and Democrats support it. But of course, you can never account for a Donald Trump. Imagine, in 2030, 2035, the submarines are being built. Donald Trump doesn't like something the Australian Prime Minister has tweeted, and he cuts off support for the technology. These things can never be accounted for. But ultimately, if you were, pitching in and, you need allies, who would you go in with? I think the Americans are ultimately more capable, more advanced, more sophisticated than anyone else, and it's a gamble that the Australians definitely feel is worth taking.
Shashank Joshi from The Economist. Appreciate your time. Shashank's the defence editor there. Victor Gao is a former Chinese diplomat, vice president at the Centre for China and Globalisation. What's your reaction to this deal, please, sir?
Thank you very much for having me. I think from the Chinese perspective, this AUKUS deal is a direct violation of the Nuclear Weapon Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. It is also a violation of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Arrangement, and therefore China firmly opposes it. China is raising objection within the framework of IAEA in Vienna, so there is still no verdict. Now, I think from the British perspective, they really need to think twice about this deal. First of all, just imagine another country will do the same thing with a country like, let's say, Argentina. What will be the position of the United Kingdom? If they want to do this kind of deal to other countries, and if this becomes a precedent, do you really think global peace and stability will be enhanced or not? If Britain is so desperate as to try to make huge sum of money from an arms deal with Australia at the expense of Australia peace and stability, then I don't think this is something laudable. Now, secondly, allow me to emphasize again, Australia up to now lives in a bubble because it is a nuclear-free country. It has a commitment within the United Nations Nuclear Weapon Non-Proliferation Treaty. It lives in this big bubble of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. And do you really think the United Kingdom and the United States want to deprive the Australian people of that rare opportunity and privilege of living in a nuclear-free bubble? Because if you tingle with nuclear submarines like this, even though you may argue, well, it is nuclear powered rather than nuclear armed, for example, you may really deprive the Australian people of that rare privilege of living in a nuclear-free bubble. This will be of huge consequence to people in Australia. Further, just imagine, if you really push your imagination to the extreme, just imagine if there is any reunification across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, China will not be an aggressor or an intruder. If you call China as an aggressor or an intruder, you should call Abraham Lincoln as an intruder, an aggressor, and an occupier of the Confederate States. There is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China. Okay. The United Kingdom fully acknowledges that policy. So do you really want to tingle with fire, play with fire?
Okay. So,
and imagine a country like...
hello, are you still there?
In a matter of war... I'm here.
Okay, so we'll use our imagination then, as you suggest. Let's imagine we didn't do this. So we just allowed China's armed forces to grow and grow. The Chinese defence budget is increasing by 7.2% in 2023. The Pentagon, and I'm sure you'll contest this, says China will have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. Enormous Navy and Air Force too, and growing. What's the UK and America supposed to do? Just let China get on with it. I mean, everybody wants a free rein.
Thank you very much. You are raising a very important question. Now, first of all, war between China and the United States is impossible. Why? Because both countries are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And it will be completely idiosyncratic to imagine that a war breaking out between China and the United States will be remaining within the conventional war framework without escalation into an Armageddon. Therefore, everyone, including all of us, Great Britain, Australia, you name it, all NATO member countries, need to urge peace between China and the United States rather than pouring more fuel onto the fire of intensifying and accelerating tensions between Washington and Beijing. Secondly, just imagine if war does break out, for example, What can Australia do? A population of 23 million caught up in a direct war between China with 1.4 billion people, and its population is larger than the OECD countries combined, and the United States with 330 million people. Holy cow. I hope Australia will really have its own independence and the sanity of the mind to believe that a war breaking out between China and the United States will really be leading to Armageddon.
Okay, well,
And
Australia wants to be part of the deterrent. Australia wants to be part of the deterrent, and it does seem to have popular cross-political support in Australia. So, that's their decision. I mean, regarding Taiwan, your president has told the army to be ready for an invasion by 2027. But from what you said, it wouldn't be an invasion because Taiwan's just part of China. So why does he talk in terms of invasion?
If you call invasion of Taiwan, you are calling military movements from England into Scotland as an invasion. You would call the British Army operation in Scotland as an occupation.
Well, we're all part of the same. But the British Army, we are the same country, and admittedly with an independence movement there. So, but Taiwan doesn't want to be seen. I think there's a majority there who don't want to be part of China. So do you not respect that?
Carefully. Allow me to make a point. Now the British government says they will never give Scotland a chance to do another referendum. Why don't you just give the Scottish people another chance to do referendum? If they choose independence, why don't you allow them to be independent? But there is a legal framework.
But we're not going to. But look, we haven't got nuclear warheads trained on them. I mean, it's a totally different. It's a totally different situation.
Every country is different. China is different. Okay. China, one China. Read the British government's official position. They acknowledge and they recognize there is only one China. They even acknowledge and recognize Taiwan is part of China. So why do you want to fight logicality? Okay. Why do you want to fight legality and legitimacy?
So,
come on.
In general, I just can't. So your advice to the West is just to leave China alone to carry on growing its military. It seems far-fetched.
No. I think the best approach is to recognize China as it is. China's military spending is only a fraction of that of the United States. As a matter of fact, U.S. defense spending is larger than the next 10 countries' defense spending combined. Whereas China's manufacturing capacity today is larger than the combined manufacturing capacity of the United States, Germany, and Japan. China is the largest trading nation with more than 130 countries and regions in the world, much more than the United States. Okay. Does this mean China does not need to have a stronger army and military and navy to protect its legitimate trading nations throughout the world? No. Okay. Let's be honest, let's be reasonable, and let's be sane, rather than, for example, try to believe that you can arm to the teeth to confront China. China is not going to be wrestled down to the ground without consequences. Okay. Deal with China as it is, promote peace rather than war, and don't agitate for war.
Thanks very much, Victor Gao, former Chinese diplomat. We can speak to a former senior British diplomat now, Andrew Levy. Andrew, I suppose you can now tell me all the stuff that I should have just put to Mr. Gao there, but what's your reaction to what you've just heard?
Well, yes, I think your listeners will have a feeling perhaps about Mr. Gao's purpose and the validity of what he's been saying. President Xi talked about, just yesterday or the day before, about the Chinese armed forces becoming a great wall of steel, which, in the light of what Mr. Gao has said, doesn't sound quite so defensive as it might otherwise have. It perhaps sounds rather aggressive. But I think what's happening is that a 40-year development that we've all lived through is at a massive turning point now. 40 years ago, and for a couple of decades after that, Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leadership were certainly trying to develop China dramatically, but were not trying to end the US global system that we've all lived through since 1945. What's happened with President Xi is that he has decided that that has to be broken. And that's incredibly dangerous. Now, we can all argue about which country should have what power and what the consequences of that are. But the fact is that the one system we have is led by the USA. And for the USA to lead it globally, it has to be able to bundle, focus and exercise such ultimately irresistible power wherever and whenever it deems it necessary, that it's always preeminent. And you can tell from what Mr. Gao said that is absolutely anathema to the Chinese government, Chinese leadership, who, provided him with the lines that he's very eloquently put to you.
So what's the answer then? Meet strength and firepower with more strength and firepower.
Certainly, if you listen to on the 16th of November, I strongly recommend listening to an interview that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the USA, gave standing alongside the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. It's available on YouTube. He set out extremely clearly that China wants to become number one. China is doing this, that, and the other to become number one. He was talking mainly militarily, but that's absolutely crucial to all this, as you, of course, have been discussing this morning. China is not going to become number one. This is a paraphrase of what he said. Yeah, and when he says number one, when he says the USA is going to remain number one, he's saying exactly what I just said. It's not about just being number one. It's about being preeminent and being able to assert yourself effectively wherever, whenever on the globe. Now, the thing is, if the USA can't do that, there is no alternative. There is no order. There is basically a descent into likely chaos. And I think actually Mr. Gao's presentation was very redolent of that potential chaos. So this AUKUS deal, this nuclear submarine deal, is a smallish part, not that small, as Shashank Joshi explained, but a smallish part of a global, absolutely existential set of developments that we are now living through.
What is the answer to somebody like Vic, who's texted us, who says our national security isn't threatened by either China or Russia?
Our national security depends on well, I'll go back one step. Mm-hmm. Since the mid-19th century, and certainly since the late 19th and early 20th century, the technologies that we have had, ranging from steam power through the internal combustion engine, telecommunications, now the internet, intercontinental ballistic missiles, of course, all those technologies have, as has often been said over the decades, have shrunk the world. What they mean is that there's no region. Victor Gao was saying, there's no region where you can hide. You can't have a little corner of the world where you're safe. We're all totally interconnected. In the days of the Roman Empire, what was going on in the Roman Empire didn't really affect China, for example. Now everybody's affected by everything, and what that means is that unless you have some sort of world government that also deals with trading relations and the development of prosperity and so on, and issues like climate change, by the way, unless you have some sort of world government, you need to have a preeminent power, because without a preeminent power, what you have is a lot of or even just several jostling powers with no real mechanism to overcome the differences between them. What we think of as the multilateral, rules-based international rule of law system is in fact a US-led, US-guaranteed, in many respects US-dominated, one would have to say, I don't mean that negatively, system. We've all lived through it since 1945, since the creation of the United Nations, and various regional bodies like the EU, for example, which are very important to that whole system. And without those functioning well, it's not guaranteed that we fall into appalling chaos like we did between 1914 and 1945, but it is a very high likelihood.
But we've effectively funded China, haven't we, through using it as the manufacturer of everything we feel as if we need to live.
Yes, we have.
It's mad. Let me put this to you. Miles in Manchester says, I'm listening to Mr. Gow and I'm terrified. Should I bother finishing the ironing this morning? Well, I think you probably should, shouldn't he, Andrew? But perhaps not buy a new washing machine. Let's put it like that. But I mean, it's...
No, I really, I'm laughing, but of course it's very. I feel for him. He should definitely finish the ironing. I'm always in favour of getting the ironing right. Mm-hmm. I think he's right. I was listening to Mr. Gow as well, and beneath a very polished presentation, it was extremely aggressive and troubling. Just what he said about Taiwan, you engaged with him on that very effectively.
Well, and painting a target on Australia's back as well was quite dark. Is what he's saying the Australians had done to themselves by subscribing.
That's right, and all of the somewhat reasonable sounding points he was trying to make. Some of them sounded much less reasonable, I think, to anybody, but some of them maybe sounded a bit reasonable. Why do you want to get into this kind of conflict when you could have your nice little bubble that you could live in, talking to the Australians? Well, what he wasn't saying, and what is fundamental, is, as I mentioned before, the intention of President Xi and the Chinese leadership, in contrast to Deng Xiaoping all those years ago, is to break the US-led system. Now, there are people who don't like America, don't like the system. It's very imperfect. Most Americans would agree it's very imperfect. It's all we've got.
Okay. Andrew Levy, thank you very much indeed. We'll see if we can find something more cheerful to talk about after 11:30. Oh yes, we got National Hunt Racing at its very best at the Cheltenham Festival. It's just gone 11:30.
Listen on BBC Sounds.